Welcome, comrades, to the delayed session.
Right, the subject is socialist society. And I wrote on this subject in 1993 in Critique 25. It's about 20-something pages there. Quite obviously, I can't go through all of what I have there. So I'll just take a number of topics effectively on the subject. It's interesting that there aren't more discussions and debates and more writings on it. I was quite surprised to discover and continue to discover that people don't actually write on it. Well, and I really had to go back in time because to prepare for this. So what I wrote was in 1993. It's 27 years ago, and in fact didn't return to it, nor did I find anybody, in fact, going back to it. Although it's very obviously something which we should be talking about. Well, firstly, we all understand that as socialists we are going towards a planned society in which the majority, in which in fact all people will be involved very closely, and that itself is a statement that it will be a highly democratic society, that it will be a society in which everyone will take part in a way that does not exist today. So in other words, it's going to be far more bureaucratic. It'll be far more democratic as opposed to the bureaucratic and undemocratic forms that exist today. Well, that requires, of course, considerable change. And it's that in fact, the discussion around the question of a social society is. Marx went into some detail, effectively, in discussing it. So there is a history of the discussion, and of course some detail. But beyond that, there's very little. And in fact, today, most of the discussion amounts to a refutation of what existed in the Soviet Union or what exists in the present bureaucratically run societies, as in Cuba or in China. Quite obviously, any genuine socialist has to be critical, and very critical, of what exists in those societies. But because they have the publicity and the resources, they tend to dominate when discussing the question of socialism. So it is essential, effectively, to discuss what we do think that we are aiming for. Now, when we look at it, there are a series of statements that we necessarily make. One is that it will be a society in which the incentives will be based on a different form and different content to what exists today. Today, the basic incentive for anybody to do anything of importance and to work is simply the payment of money. So that the incentive is money. Quite obviously, that cannot be the basic incentive in a socialist society. So, in fact, the purpose of a socialist society is to have incentives, or to have the basic incentive, much closer to the nature of humanity. On the other hand, if we actually look at what happened to the Soviet Union, what we see is that no one wanted to work. That it was a society which nominally had money, but the nominal money couldn't buy very much. So the effect was to dull all incentives. The result of that has been that many people concluded that the socialist understanding of a society with direct relations and other incentives than money, exchange value, could not exist, or insofar as something came into existence, as in the Soviet Union, it would not last. What therefore we have to describe as a society in which people work because they enjoy the work. And that's precisely what Marx, of course, says, that a social society is a society in which people will enjoy their work. It becomes their prime enjoyment, in fact. Having said that, of course, we're then posing a society which is very different, and which most people, or many people, most people today, because they don't know anything else, would assume couldn't exist. That's to say, they think the only possible incentive must in the end go back to money. So one of the first conditions of a social society is the contrary, that the population as a whole, that's to say the working population, because quite obviously you don't expect children to work, and you don't expect people over a certain age either. So, but the vast majority of the population, in other words, have to have an incentive other than simply getting more money. And the incentive lies in the work itself, so that one of the prime conditions of a socialist society is that they've reached a level, or it has reached a level of production such that it's possible to provide the means of livelihood free to everybody in the society as a whole. So work becomes humanity's prime necessity, and the means of existence are provided free because they've reached a level where we have relative abundance. Obviously, I've made a number of conditions which appear utterly utopian today. So, if we talk of abundance, and I use the words relative abundance, but in the text when discussing socialism, when they discuss the question of abundance, they simply talk about abundance. But in fact, there are a number of items which probably would have to be rationed or controlled or whatever else it is, because it's difficult to reproduce. If you think of the elements, the chemical elements, there's at least one which I came across, which it turns out it is relatively short, even with the best of machines or whatever. However, of course, one doesn't always have to use that particular element, and one can find ways around it. So I'm just explaining with one example why one really should talk of relative abundance. However, the way that industry and agriculture have progressed has been a steady rise, and the various important turnarounds, as it were. Agriculture has been able to reach new levels in general. We know, for instance, that in terms of the EU itself, they in fact had reached, this was, when was it, about 20 years ago or 30 years ago, reached a level where of overproduction where they incentivized reduction in output. And there are, of course, lots of arguments, lots of people, lots of books which might argue that there'll be some sort of absolute level that cannot be reached, required, in other words, and that we will not be able to raise the level of agriculture for the purpose. In other words, we won't have enough food. In fact, what's of course also happening is that the total population of the Earth is not expanding as fast as they might have thought. In fact, it's not slowing. It hasn't. The expansion has slowed, but the total number of the population of the world has continued to increase. But it's clear that it will reach a steady state, not too far from today. So, in other words, when we talk of abundance, it does appear to be a possibility or a reality in the future, in that the total population of the Earth will either slow down sufficiently, or in fact reach a certain total beyond which it may not wish to go. It'll be under much greater control. It is under much greater control compared to what it was 20 years ago. So what I'm discussing here is whether it is possible, in fact, to have enough for all, and the answer is yes. Because, again, it's not just a question of controlling the population, it's also a question of total production. And again, humanity seems to have been able to find ways of raising output over time. In agriculture, I'm talking about agriculture because as food, of course, it is the first essential. Again, of course, the incentive to act in the way I've just described is not built into capitalism. If anything, the opposite is built into capitalism. The incentives there are based on profits, which don't go in the same direction, of course. So the point I've just been making is that the demand that in socialism that money would be abolished is not utopian. It is quite possible and very likely. And of course, there's a slight push in that direction as we watch the way in which we are increasingly using the banks rather than money directly. And what's happening is more of a direct exchange, and so much so that in fact you could imagine that in effect the employer will simply pay in the sum that he's supposed to pay into the bank. You never see it and never know what it is. It's simply agreed that you have a surplus above a certain level, a surplus above your immediate needs. Well, what I've just been doing is trying to discuss one of the first conditions of a genuine social society, and that is one in which the people no longer work simply for money. Money is not the issue. Money is under control. That everybody has enough, in the first instance, enough to eat, and in the second instance, if people want anything, they will go and get it. There's no reason to limit them. People will not be wasteful, as it were, in that sense, in the sense of today. They would not see things in those terms. Well, if we look at one aspect of this, which is really a side issue, but brings out the issue, is the enormous waste that we have in our society. From the enormous amount wasted on weapons, the United States officially spends over $700 billion simply on arms. That's in the annual budget. The reality is they spend considerably more than $700 billion on the military, which is de facto complete waste. It's waste even today because it's not really clear whom they are going to fight. They can't really drop start an atomic war and expect kind of to continue to exist after that. So they're actually producing more and more atomic bombs as simply part of their economic structure, effectively, because it's obvious that they're not going to get a direct attack of any meaning which requires that they use atomic weapons. So it's just pure waste, and waste around the world, which in part is there not for the purpose of having a war, but simply to balance the economic structure of the particular country and of the world market. Second form of production which is wasteful is the considerable surplus which goes to the very wealthy. You're talking, of course, of most particularly the United States, where you have, I don't know the figure of how many people are very wealthy, but who have multi-billions in dollars. And it's not just a question of holding the dollars. It's a distortion of the nature of the production itself, that it is based a considerable amount of what is produced is distorted in order to satisfy those who can actually buy it. So you have particular kinds of cars which are really total waste in the society, which involves a whole series of other things other than cars. like a sport with competitive special types of cars, etc., etc. So, so the whole nature of production would itself change in the direction of supplying the majority. At first, of course, it would be at an absolute kind of level to raise the standard of living of everyone, and as the total amount increases and there's a surplus, there'll be more choice. The third aspect of waste is competition, which would be abolished. The only point of competition is to make people work harder or discover something they might not discover otherwise, as it were. But if you're in a society in which people are honest, keen to work, and have had an excellent education, they will enjoy their work and work far harder than they would have worked if they were in competition. So competition then becomes redundant. But what that means is that the various competitive firms wouldn't exist. You'd have one or two firms in whatever it is. I shouldn't say firms because it would simply one or two entities. We don't know the structure of those kinds of entities. At any rate, what you won't have is any number of firms all competing to produce the same product, etc., which is necessary under capitalism as an incentive. The argument for it, of course, that's given all the time is that it's part of human nature. And what, of course, we're arguing is that that is simply not true. It's simply a form by which the economy takes and is necessary to the development of capitalism itself. Fourth form of waste is clearly the high level of unemployment. Officially, I think in Britain at the moment, around 5%, plus the number who are out of work today because of the virus. The unemployment level, therefore, is far higher than would exist in a social society. Social society would be abolished. And of course, there, until 1970 something or other, there was full employment in Britain and in other developed countries. So it's clearly possible to do it, even under capitalism, although it does make capitalism unstable. At any rate, the point is there would be full employment. And there would be, of course, sufficient resources. That's to say, you couldn't reduce the level of resources to the exact amount which was required, because you couldn't predict it. So there would have to be a surplus of the total resources that are used and the total products as well. Sixthly, in this list, one could no doubt produce a very long list, but I produced 7 items which we could talk about as a release of increased resources for society as a whole today, which would allow us to go much closer to the development of socialism even today. Sixthly, there is the apparatus of control, which is necessary to capitalism, but it is a complete waste otherwise. And thinking of the army, the police, the system of censorship, the system of supervision, the bureaucratic apparatus of control, which exists, of course, in considerable fashion in certain societies, but in our society too we have an apparatus of management, which too could be much less. So it's a form of control. The result of moving towards a society which is genuinely free would be a release of creative potential, or putting it the other, which I've just put it the opposite way to what I'm doing. And that's to say, I'm implying that creative potential in our society is controlled or not allowed to be creative. And that a social society would be far more creative as a result. Well, the point of bringing this out is that these various instances of waste is to say that in a social society, the potential, even without the extra which would come about through the further development of resources which becomes possible, and the change in direction, that the creative potential is very, very considerable. And so if we think about the possibilities, they become very extensive, and that in fact the release from capitalism would permit the development of a society of abundance. Because one of the conditions, which I've already implied, of a social society would be that there would be abundance. Now, it would be put together by planning, by a plan, so society would be planned. So that would mean it would be planned by the, as Marx put it, by the associated producers themselves. In other words, there'd be a planning system and a planning apparatus which would permit it. People would work because they enjoy the work. The work may well be necessary, but they would enjoy the work. Work which was unenjoyable, which was awful, would be gradually phased out. And that's perfectly possible, because we know today that it is possible to use machinery, mechanize the form of production to a far higher level. The fact that it's not done, or that the rate of growth is so low, which it is today, and in fact it became lower at the same point as the turn to the right in 1980. So the potential, in other words, for a society of abundance, a society where work becomes humanity's prime want, as Marx put it, is clearly there, and it is inevitable that it go that way. But society, however slowly and however awfully, is actually going there. It's true that it's taking far longer than socialists expect. So how much longer have I got? Sorry.
Up to you, Conrad. You can stop now. We can take some questions, or you can carry on a bit longer if you want.
Oh, sorry. How much longer?
Sorry, I said it's up to you, comrade. You can speak a bit longer if you want, or we can take some questions and you can come back on them if you like.
Okay, well then I'll just finish up. So a program for socialist change would have to involve the nationalization of the means of distribution, of production, distribution, and exchange. It would involve workers' election of managers, supervisors, and so on. It would involve the rotation of managers and workers. No one in the initial stages when money still exists, no one at all in society would receive more than the wage of a skilled worker. You would expect that payment would reverse itself. That's to say that people doing lousy jobs which were dirty, difficult, without any kind of enjoyment and so forth, would be the best paid, and the jobs in which people really enjoy themselves would be the worst paid, because people would get their enjoyment in the work itself. But the supposition there is that everyone in society would get sufficient to eat, have good housing, and all the other conditions. So the point here is simply that there would have to be a phasing out of unskilled and difficult and lousy work, as it were. Different views, different platforms and parties would all have to be encouraged. At the same time, you would have a centralized and decentralized planning. You can't just have a centralized planning. I'm saying this because the line of the Soviet Union, of course, was centralized planning. And I've had a number of arguments on this. It never occurred to me before that there'd be an aim to have totally centralized planning. I can't understand why people would argue it. The idea that, therefore, as it were, the planning of the whole world would take place in New York and New York alone, which is technically possible, as it were. It never occurred to me that anybody would argue like that, but some people do argue that everything would be put together in one place and then it would go out. But if you think about it, it's not possible, and nobody really wants it. If you're living in an area with a forest of a kind, who plans the forest? A group of people in New York. That's completely nutty. They don't know anything about it, and it's ridiculous. They should have to travel to see it and then go back and then forget it. Obviously, it makes more sense to have a level of devolution where it's directly required, and perhaps where a particular specialization occurs. There's no problem about it, because what one is talking about is a society of the earth as a whole, that the earth as a whole will have a series of governments, a series of forms of control, and no doubt an international form, which would be a superior form, or not like, but take the place of the United Nations. So that you would have to have both central planning and decentralized planning, which is most efficient and which people approve of, and where the influence of whoever there is can be shown. The planners themselves would have to be subject to a political body, which would be regularly elected. I don't think there's any way around that. One could argue, because at one time people seemed to be arguing that there would simply be planning, and that would be the beginning and end of it. But not everybody wants to be a planner, and not everybody can be a planner. On the other hand, you would want as many as possible to be involved in planning for at least a short time, so they know what is actually going on. You can't just have planners standing separate from the society as a whole. So you would expect there be both a political form which involves itself with discussing with the planners and some form of election of that, and that the actual people doing the planning would themselves go to other jobs and come back, so they'd understand what society is and what it wants. In other words, you would want, simply in these terms, to make it as democratic as possible, and not just with instructions coming from some central body. So the planners would rotate their positions with enterprises and have other jobs, white collar, blue collar. In fact, the number of blue collar jobs would go down next to zero. In the United States today, the number of blue collar jobs is the percentage is 29%, and quite clearly you expect that to go down quite fast. So the percentage who would actually be involved with directly blue collar jobs going to be very small, quite obviously, because there'd be increasing degree of mechanization of everything. So, everything which makes sense. So the number of people who would be directly involved with simply putting screws in would be very, very small. So you're talking of completely different forms existing. Well, I'll just finish this then with saying that what in fact we live in is a transition period towards socialism. And if we look around, we can see the bits and pieces which could be involved, but which have to be changed. I don't think there'll be any form now existing which would not have to be changed in a socialist society. In other words, in this transitional period in which we live, there are forms which in fact are no longer simply capitalist, but they're not socialist either. The market has clearly continued, but it is continuing in a form which is not the same as it was. But we would expect, as we move towards socialism, that the market then would be phased out. In a fully socialist society, of course, as I'm implying, there would be no market. And in fact, you wouldn't have money. The market itself would be phased out first in traditionally non-market areas of production, etc., and would continue. The last aspect which I have to mention is a question of education. Education would have to be entirely different from what we have today. Today it's actually very poor. What is needed is to be able to inspire the pupils, to inspire those who are being educated, and to be able to teach them not just a whole series of details, which is what they are taught today, apart from languages, but to be able to engage the pupils with the subject to a much deeper degree than they are. And the whole incentive system itself would have to be changed. Anyway, the upshot of that is that the whole nature of society would be changed. Whatever one's referring to, whether it's the rewards, it's the education, whether it's the form of health, etc., etc. It would become the ideal society, and it's not difficult to argue that it's not a utopia. It doesn't have to be a utopia. Obviously, people will still have limited lives. People will still get ill, and there'll still be arguments, and there'll still be progress. But the society would be at a much higher level. It would be a level where everybody in the end would be enjoying themselves, instead of, as today, the majority have a very hard life. Thank you.
Thank you very much, comrade. I enjoyed that.
Sorry.
I always do your sessions. Thank you very much, comrade. I think there's a huge amount of issues that the comrade has touched upon, and there's been some comments in the chat Please raise your hand if you want to ask questions or make a comment. I think there's a clearly a transition period would happen after some kind of revolution, during which there would still have to be some kind of money or payment. But Hillel was talking about the society as it would be then 50 years, 30 years after some kind of transition to a socialist society. We didn't talk about how to get there, because that is another subject altogether, and we've touched upon those things plenty in Kevin's series on revolutions. This was an attempt to look at what a socialist society could look at. So I urge comrades to get into that. Before I do that, though, I was going to read out a quote, because I think the subject of work in particular got people a bit agitated. You know, there will always be crappy work, and there will always be jobs that we don't like doing, etc. I mean, there are issues like, you know, once you organize work effectively and efficiently, and you know, you don't have to have people hunching over strawberry fields to pick fruit. I mean, this could be done with machines, but it is often cheaper to get some workers from Eastern Europe. You know, that'll change now after Brexit. That's not going to happen for much longer. But there are ways to do waste disposal much more efficient than it's being done now. But I was going to read out a quote, a very famous quote from Marx on the matter of work and how work would be organized in a socialist society. Which I very much like. Says, in a communist society where nobody has one exclusive field of activity, but each can become accomplished in any branch he wishes, or she wishes, society regulates the general production and thus makes it possible for me to do one thing today, another tomorrow, to hunt in the morning, fish in the afternoon, rear cattle in the evening, criticize after dinner, just as I have a mind without ever becoming hunter, fisherman, herdsman, or critic. And together with that is, of course, the question of who does the planning. All of us, you know, if everybody becomes a bureaucrat and gets involved with the planning, nobody's a bureaucrat. That's another quite good quote I like. Okay, Tony and Alan are the first contributors from the floor. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, all of this, in a sense, is speculative, because we are no nearer socialism today than 200 years ago. And you talk about the elimination of unenjoyable work. I would put it to you that is a utopian. There are certain tasks which I don't think can be simply eliminated. I mean, I don't know whether we can have bottom wipers, for example, mechanized, and other aspects of care in society. But I do think there is some work which will, of its very nature, will have to be done, but which isn't enjoyable. The question is whether that kind of work is shared around as much as anything else. I realize what Tina said about we've got other sessions, but we are in a situation. I mean, I used to believe that we would see socialism in my lifetime. I don't believe that any longer. What do you think? Where do you think things have gone wrong? Where are the agencies of change? I mean, you mentioned that in America, blue-collar work has gone down to 29%. Surely we're facing, I mean, given the working class is seen as the agent of change and revolution, what we're seeing is, in essence, the export of blue-collar jobs to the third and underdeveloped work, and that poses certainly a problem in the West. So I'll leave it at that anyway.
Thanks, Tony. Hillel, I suggest I take 2 or 3 comments, if that's okay. All right. Are we no nearer socialism today than 200 years ago? Well, productive forces have developed a lot since, so I think abundance is now becoming a possibility. Yes. But I'm not arguing with you. I'm going to bring in Alan, please.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. I'd actually like to take the discussion back a little bit to how we're using the term socialism, because people will hear the word socialism used by different people in different ways. There have in the past, and indeed there still are some today, who use socialism to describe the Stalinist led states like the Soviet Union and after its degeneration, China, Cuba, Vietnam, and so on, and Eastern Europe. other people use socialism to mean some kind of social democratic regulation of capitalism, like Bernie Sanders, for instance, who, when pressed on the question of socialism, looked to Denmark and similar states as the example of what he understood by socialism. So I think that's important. And there's amongst those who call themselves Marxists, who might, outside the Stalinist school, who would reject both those ideas, I think there is still some difference, and I think that's been apparent so far. I would personally use the term socialism to describe what I think Hillel described as fully developed socialism, or fully socialist society, where there are no classes, there is no state in the sense which we understand it, there are no bureaucrats. I think that the quote Tina gave is that there are no bureaucrats, we are all involved in administration, is a better way to describe it. There's no money, there's no market, there's no capital, in the sense that Marx understands that. That's what I think Marx was talking about when he talked about what socialism was. Now, the problem is it gets confused, I think, with the seizure of power and the overthrow of the capitalist state. And I think that period is often described as socialism, and it's not. I don't think there was socialism in the Soviet Union at any stage, even before the Stalinist generation. What you had was the dictatorship of the proletariat, which opens up the period of transition of society away from class society to get to what Hillel talked at the beginning, a society where the decisions about society are made by all producers, and that can be done because there are no class divisions, there are no separate class interests which can get in the way of that decisions being made by all the producers. And I think that's important too in terms of the question of the state, because after the seizure of power, we're still going to have a state, a body of armed force which regulates society. And that's because there are still class antagonisms within the dictatorship of the proletariat. And so, as Lenin outlines in State and Revolution, a big part of the role of this transitional period of the dictatorship of the proletariat is decreasing the state, getting rid of the state, the withering away of the state. And I think that's important so that we understand what we're talking about, that socialism is the end goal after we've taken state power, and the aim of taking state power is to create the conditions for the creation of socialism. I don't know if that's controversial or not, but that's my understanding of how Marx understood it, and certainly the Bolsheviks understood it. Finish.
Thank you, comrade. I'm taking Pam in and then bring back Hillel. Hello, Pam.
Yeah, I didn't intend to speak, but I will. Sorry.
Oh, you raised your hand. You just muted yourself, comrade. Sorry.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Hillel. I'll just say something. I mean, I think, although, as Hillel says, that the vision seems utopian now. However, there's such massive contradictions in the world, and although we're seeing, for instance, in the US, that nearly half the population voted for Trump and didn't want to follow any sort of progressive ideas. Not that I mean, the Democrats are a bourgeois party, but we can see it's so easy to use our resources, even now under capitalism, to provide for people. And as Tony was saying, there's so much mutual aid going on in society. It is a natural human wish to help others and care for others. Like Tony, I thought I might see socialism in 1968, but it does seem a lot further away. But I remain optimistic. Anyway, thanks. I'm afraid I've got to go. Bye.
Thanks, Pam. Okay, Hillel, would you like to reply to a few things? Sorry, comrade, you're muted. Not quite sure how that happened. I might have... There you go.
Okay. Okay. Yes. Well, first, with Pam, clearly each of us has a particular expectation as to when socialism will come about, as it were, because it has been an enormous disappointment in that it is taking so long to come about. Quite clearly, if you read Lenin or Marx, or for that matter, even Trotsky, their expectation was such that we would have expected to have been in socialism some time ago. That's clear. And it's really up to us to work out an understanding of the societies, the transitional form of society that exists today. I saw that people are not very clear what they describe present-day society as. Well, of course, it was argued by Lenin and Trotsky that after 1917 the world had moved into a transitional form. I completely agree with that, and it's not difficult to show it. You can go through a series of forms which have come into existence, which would not have come into existence if not for the changes which did come about. Even the vote, if you actually look at it, in Britain, of course, the vote was given to all only in 1928. Only in 1928 did all women get the vote. So, and clearly the revolution itself for 17 played a role in that. So one can go through it. It's through the different political and economic forms and show how, in a sense, they do reflect the transitional form in which we actually exist. It's in fact, it's worth actually writing a book about that. It seems to me. Certainly, in terms of expectation, I didn't have the kind of expectation myself that Pam referred to, and that was because the leader, really, of South African Trotskyism, who was underground from 1939 onwards, impressed on me on the one occasion when I spoke to him that it would take a long time, and he was doing that in order that I didn't give up, as it were. But it worked. It has taken a long time, and how much longer it'll take, I don't know. But in between 1917 and when the final revolution takes place, may take a considerable amount of more time. I don't know. But one of the features, I hope, of socialists is that they're optimistic. And it's perfectly possible to produce a series of arguments which would say that it isn't going to take another 100 years, or maybe not even 50 years, or maybe even quicker. Anyway, in relation to Tony's points, I've partly answered him when he says that we're no nearer than 200 years ago. That's simply not true. We may not be, well, I don't know what 200 years here means, but we may not have a revolution or may not have a change, because I'm not certain the exact form that changes is going to take place, is actually going to take. But we may not have that revolution for some time. But that doesn't mean to say that, to repeat myself, there hasn't been very considerable change, and that it will be, in a sense, easier in the intermediate period when we do have a socialist government in power in the United States. We are not living in a period when there could be some sort of freak taking of power in some third world country, and the rest of the world will then go socialist. That won't happen. That can't happen. If you look at it today, we're living in a world which is ruled by the United States. Okay. Trump tried to reduce the globalist nature of the United States, but that's not really possible. The ruling class clearly didn't like it, and basically they've thrown him out. The world is ruled by the United States in the end, or the United States with some degree of consultation with a few other governments from time to time, but it is essentially ruled by the United States. So as the United States changes, we can see the world changing. The fact that it has blown up in this way is extremely important, because if it didn't, there wouldn't be that much change elsewhere. The fact is, at the moment, if one looks at it, it's extremely difficult to imagine the world 20 years hence. Today, the third world is in absolute crisis. It can't continue the way it is. It just can't. I don't know what will happen, but it can't go on like this. With the number of people out of work. In South Africa, officially, they declared 25% unemployment. The real level is 40 to 60%. It's the same all over, effectively. So we are talking of a world which can't continue in the present the way it is. The United States didn't blow up by some kind of accident, and it's not going to socialism tomorrow. But it is part of the forces of change. It's true that the bourgeoisie has been strong enough and the socialist forces weak enough for capitalism to continue. But the forms that are coming into existence are very often forms, in fact forms which are intermediate, not intermediate in the sense that in any sense they're actually socialist, but they are not the forms that an ideal capitalism would have preferred or one could have predicted. The fact is, in a purely technical level, if you want to look at it, in 1900 you hardly had a budget in Britain. Today the budget's extremely important. It's the same applies to the United States, of course, and it goes beyond that. In other words, there's a level of semi-planning which is inbuilt into capitalism today, in which they don't like and they do their best to stop it. Introducing various laws to that effect. So the fact they have to introduce laws to that effect shows you that the society itself is necessarily moving beyond capitalism. It is still capitalism in certain respects, but it's not just capitalism anymore. So when we analyze it, we have to analyze it in that form. The idea that we couldn't go to socialism one lifetime, I don't know. I think it's perfectly possible that well, from 10 to 20 years, you will look at this question in a very, very different way. I don't see how that can be avoided, because the capitalist class has no solution for the present crisis. And in fact, the crisis of capitalism is so bad that you can't use the word crisis anymore. It's beyond crisis. For 20 years, for 12 years, from 2008 down to the present, it's been bound in what would have been called a crisis. You can't. There's no point in calling it a crisis anymore, because it's permanent. And capitalism continues in its own particular way. I think that's the reality. The other reality is the degree of the way in which most people are fed up with society itself. It's obviously true of the third world as a whole. In other words, the majority of the world. People accept what exists because they have no alternative. And the punishment for stepping out of line can be vicious. If you just look at China, that is the case. But if we talk of China, we immediately think that it can't last the way it is. People didn't expect it to last this long. The United States, the ruling power in the United States, clearly didn't. They thought that by making concessions and in effect extending capitalism in China, because today in China somewhere between 60 to 80% of the economy is private enterprise. They thought that by doing so they would end the peasant structure. It failed. So what I'm getting at is that the forces of change are there. When Trotsky called it a transition period, he was right. It is a transition period. There are considerable changes. They ought to be discussed and theorized. The left isn't doing it, but it ought to do it. And the result is that people become pessimistic. But there's no reason to be pessimistic in a more general sense. One can be pessimistic in a sense that you may never see it. And I'm 83, I don't expect to see very much. But that doesn't alter the point. The second speaker gave a general talk, effectively, on what is socialism, and it's it's true at the present time. The term socialism is used simply because the word communism can't be used since Stalinism was so awful. So we can't use communism at all. So the only alternative would appear to be used was socialism. So we use socialism instead of what we would have used, let's say, communism. And when I was talking about socialism, that is what I was talking about. The society, in effect, the ultimate form of a fully democratic society controlled from below, where the other aspects which we've referred to would come into existence. Of course, the state would have to be abolished, but it can only be abolished when the society is ready to abolish it. In a period when the present transition period comes to an end, the state will continue, obviously, but there's no reason to assume that it would continue very much longer. what is a state? The state is defined in Marxism as an apparatus of force. Well, why would they need force if everyone is well off and getting better off all the time? They wouldn't. So that's the point when socialism becomes socialism itself, or what we would have called you have a fully communist society. Thank you.
Thank you, comrade. Yes, I say that I quite agree. Capitalism has no solution to the current problems and issues we're facing, especially the ecological crisis, which has been mentioned in the chat quite a few times. The capitalism needs to grow constantly. It constantly needs to make profit. It needs to expand constantly. Otherwise, it goes down, and that does just not go very well with the finite resources of the planet. So there is no way out for capitalism. On the other hand, though, there is certainly the working class as a class doesn't seem to have much of a solution at the moment either. And I think the role of a vision for our forces is quite important and something we need to talk about. You know, what do we actually fight for? What does socialism mean, and how can we inspire comrades to fight for it? And I think in a period where we had a socialist at the helm of the Labour Party for 5 years, and the solutions there, be it on the ecological crisis or any other crisis were proposed, were, I think, not as inspiring as they could have been. So I think that it is also up to us to develop a vision of socialism that can actually inspire comrades. I'm bringing in Kevin Bean now. Hello, Kevin.
Okay, thanks, Tina. Thanks, Hillel, for the talk. Many of the points that I wanted to ask you about, or to make myself, you covered actually in your last response on the issue of the transition. And I think that phrase is very important, because one of the reasons why comrades have sort of raised problems with the idea of changing society, of moving towards socialism in any way, is, I think, this idea that somehow there are not objective tendencies in society which are moving in that direction. You use the phrase inevitable, and indeed one of the complaints that was often issued against Marxists is that we're determinists and that we expect, you know, that things will happen inevitably in that way. Now, I think the pattern that you've described is a whole number of objective tendencies in capitalism: monopolization, the semi-planning that you referred to, and of course the patterns of crisis that you suggest as well, but also the contradiction of the enormous potential of the productive forces. You know, even in my lifetime, the ability of capitalism to expand production through things like robotics, for example, even to talk in that way would have seemed fantastic when I was much younger, but now it's a sort of, you know, pattern of everyday life. So the potential is clearly there, and the tendencies inside capitalism, the sort of tendencies that Marx describes in the Communist Manifesto in outline, are already clearly there. And so, in a way, the issue of transition that you raised, Hillel, I think is the important one. It's if comrades don't see our period as one of transition, then they don't see the tendencies that exist that can actually assist the subjective factors that we put in terms of developing parties and of movements for that sort of change. So I think that's the key feature. I think the other point that I would make, and perhaps as a question, is in the terms of how we explain that in terms of our programs. There was some very interesting chat amongst comrades about the way that people had responded, say, to the vaccination program, people volunteering. And then there was also discussion in the chat about the sort of social activities that people do, helping people, you know, in quite a normal way. And indeed, the volunteering that has gone on is a sign, I think, essentially of the collective and the social nature of humanity. capitalism emphasizes the individual. We emphasize the collective. However, as you wrote in your article in 1997, Hillel, you talked about the focus on freedom, and particularly the relationship of individual freedom to collective freedom, and that the point about socialism and about the transition is actually to free the individual. Capitalism, deifies the individual and says that our system is the one that allows for complete human freedom. And of course, the reality is that capitalism is the complete opposite, and that not only through work and through the way that resources are controlled by a tiny minority is there no real freedom, but in terms of the full flourishing of an individual. And I think that one of the weaknesses of our politics is to allow the capitalists to take the idea of freedom and of human development and make it their own. We, I think, have to get back to the idea that our aim is full human freedom and the development of human potential. And the fact that even talking like that often seems utopian is the way that we've surrendered that by not, in a sense, raising, our sights, by not, for example, raising, the eyes of people to what is possible. I remember reading an article by Trotsky, many years ago, talking about human creativity, and he made the point that in ancient societies, the philosophers such as Aristotle represented a tiny minority, and that even in relatively modern or recent societies, we had gifted individuals and writers like Goethe. And his point was that our aim should be to unleash that potential of creativity, and in fact move towards a real humanity. And I think that only sounds utopian because capitalism's promise has proved ultimately worth this, but we've not been able in our politics to sort of raise the sights and even to raise those issues. We should be really setting those sorts of goals for our politics. Anyway, that's all, comrades.
Absolutely. Thank you, Kevin. I'm bringing Zbigniew. Sorry, I was trying. Hi, and then Matthew. Hi, comrade.
Oh, yes. I was just writing something in the chat about the fact that we're running out of energy. Peak oil was a long time, 15 years now, and we haven't discovered enough energy to keep the society going in its present state for much longer, because renewable energy requires oil to produce the means of production to make the turbines and to make the other machines that are used in renewable energy. So the whole idea is moving towards a possibility of collapse, not just a long depression, which we are in. So energy is the question as well. And the labour power that we will need in socialism will not be enough without energy to fuel it. So that's the one point I wanted to make. And also, as I probably raised before, the People's Republic of Walmart outlines the fact that corporations like Walmart have a planned economy in order to produce goods when they are required, and without trying to stop overproduction of and introduce planning instead. So, and in that book, they cover the question of the CIA coup in Chile, because there they had cybernetics and a planned economy using fax machines when computers were, whole houses were needed to hire them. But they had, that threatened the competitive nature of capitalism, and that's why there was the introduction of the neoliberal, and all economists had to be killed by the death squads. So those are the kind of things that we are going to be struggling of during this transition period, which has been going on since 1970. And maybe those issues could be integrated into our planning for the kind of, and maybe Hillel could maybe answer some of those questions. Thanks.
Thank you, comrade. Okay, Matthew, please.
Okay, comrades, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Right. Okay, great. I think there's a lot of stuff you can unpack in this. It's really, it's been good discussion. I think that the thing about capitalism as it exists at the moment, comrades have made the point that it is, mired in crisis. The capitalist class cannot find its way out, or doesn't have a means of finding its way out. It's actually refusing to invest. It refuses to develop anything, any further. It wishes to basically maintain or make worse the misery of much of the world's population, including, obviously the working class in the developed countries, but as you say, far worse in the third world. And the fact that you have the likes of Trump and what developed under Trump, it just shows that the American system itself cannot stand. The system itself is in a point of rot. Its basic implements of control are falling apart in its hands. After finance capital itself blew up, in 07, 08, the implements of social control are now falling apart. And for me, it was very interesting actually, to go through the experience of the Corbynism in the Labour Party, because for me, what it showed actually was the weakness of the control mechanisms, because the Labour Party has been a principal control mechanism for the ruling class in these parts for decades, the best part, certainly the best part of a century. And it was actually, the impact of Corbynism actually, despite all of its political faults, there were numerous, despite the fact that most people in it didn't understand what the hell was going on, and that's a real problem in terms of, do we actually have a conscious political agency? The problem is we don't, and we have to build one. But that movement has essentially destroyed the Labour Party as an organisation and as a mechanism. And you can see Starmer himself, finishing that work. He's going to destroy the basic organisation of the Labour Party across the country and its mechanisms for controlling different bits of the society in order to try and consolidate his own power, which is, deeply contradictory, but that's the way it'll work. I think the thing is, again, as also been said in terms of capitalism, is the move towards oligopoly, monopoly, and so on and so forth, and actually the degeneration of its own mechanisms and the mechanisms of the law of value. Interestingly enough, I've been working in a major capitalist company myself. That actually, the interesting thing about it, of course, is that as most labour, of course, now is mental. There's, as you said, so Hillel points out, the blue collar working class, the manual working class is now a minority. The majority of the working class is actually relies on mental labour. Now, the problem for the ruling class, of course, is and its management mechanisms and so on and so forth, in having that large mental workforce, of course, is control, because you can't. You just you can manually, you can run the whole nonsense with industrial engineers and Taylorism and all that sort of stuff on manual workers and so on. You can't do it. When labour is manual, you can't do it. And actually, the ruling class and the capitalists depend on the workers to collaborate in order to get things done. And if the working class itself turned around and said, well, look, we actually run this damn stuff. We have to collaborate to make this work. And actually, we can do without these people. And we could do without these people tomorrow. And it's merely a question of saying, well, the working class itself merely has to realise that it can and it must run these things in any case. And actually, the other thing, of course, is that in terms of looking at this, if you look at my sector, the sector I work in, the power sector, actually, of course, as you may well have guessed, every time you turn on a light or you start a gas boiler or whatever else, you're being robbed. Actually, you're being charged a multiple of what it should cost and what it does cost to produce that stuff. Because actually what they've done, instead of even in their old system, if you look at the old system as was you know, from the sort of 1960s onwards, of course, where they basically aggregated the entire industry from the basic part of production, the gas well, to the gas tap, or the coal mine, or whatever else, or however other means, were all integrated into one system. And what they've done is that they've shoved in, instead of having that, they've shoved in different markets in different bits, and every time the power or the components of power move from one bit to the other, somebody else takes something out, and at the end the government takes a bunch out as well. So basically you're being robbed multiple times every time you turn the light on, because of the system, because of the way the system works. You know, you could easily actually have a position now, it's available to have local control, you know, of the grid. You could have street by street control of the grid and the power system and so on. That's now available. That software is now there, you know. And this is it. You see, you can do a lot of this with machines. The interesting thing also, of course, is that if you look at what happened with the Chinese, what happened when actually capitalism moved itself, a whole chunk of its production to China, of course, it did expose this whole question, because what a lot of it, in many cases, what they did, of course, because labour was cheaper, was they actually moved from having a relatively automated production to having relatively more manual production, because it was cheaper and labour was cheap. You know, it's not logical, but that's the way that capitalism works. I think that it's also in terms of, I mean, if you look at the whole business with China as well. I mean, China, the interesting thing about China, of course, is that China actually saved, if you like, or held up capitalism in the wake of 07, 08, because it was able to as a centralized power, able then to actually lay more concrete than ever been laid in the rest of human history, etc. And essentially jack the system out of the very deep hole it was in. And of course now they're blowing out of that as well. So I mean, the key missing here is not. I mean, you know, obviously we are in a period of transition. Obviously we are in a period in which the whole basis of capitalism and its control of the society and its methods of extraction of profit, etc., are breaking down. You can see that happen all the time. The key question is, when does the working class itself and the left generate a force capable of projecting to people, one, there is an alternative, and two, we have to organise for it. I mean, at the moment, what we see, of course, you know, is we can see, you know, the explosions as the bits break, and we can see the stream of people fleeing parts of the world where the very conditions of life in many cases are being reduced. I mean, you can see it in the Middle East, you can see it in Africa. People just run. You know, why wouldn't they? I mean, this is you know, because it's become intolerable and not unsustainable. And the question really is, okay, how do we put this forward, and how do we generate something under the conditions in which everything else is breaking? And I think that's our job now.
Yeah, no small feat. Okay, Alan Gibson has another question before I bring in Hillel to sum up. Thank you.
Yeah, just a couple of points. Firstly, a small thing. I'm a supporter of a group called the Bolshevik Tendency, and unlike Hillel, we're proud to stand under the banner of communism, despite it being dragged through the mud by bureaucratic rulers of the deformed, degenerated worker states. I think socialism has been dragged through the mud just as much, if not more, certainly in the consciousness of the working class, of it being seen as just a reform of capitalism. I do want to, as I think has been talked a bit about in the chat, challenge this idea that Hillel put forward, that we're in a transitional period of society that exists today. And I understood what you're arguing, Hillel, was that there was some kind of technical objective process going on, which was pointing in the direction of increasing elements of socialism starting to appear in this period of capitalism. You talked about already existing semi-planning. I think that's a problematic way to look at things. And you can use the term transition, I guess, but certainly we're in a particular period of capitalism. of extreme crisis, and but the question of a transition, there may be a transition to socialism, but there may be a transition to barbarism, a horrific barbarism, in the context of catastrophic ecological collapse and associated social collapse that will go with that process, which, if you're looking at the balance of forces, is unfortunately perhaps more likely. I think that it's important in thinking and how we think about this is we see this question not so much in terms of technical or objective processes, but one as a political one of a change in social relations. And I think that's where our emphasis has to be. We've got to change the nature of social relations, of capitalist social relations, and that's going to be necessary to avert that catastrophe of ecological and social collapse, which is coming otherwise. We've got to take the processes of production, distribution, exchange out of private hands. We've got to popularise that idea. And as I think Tina said at one stage, I mean, capitalism is incompatible with doing what is necessary to avert that collapse. That's what we've got to make popular, that idea. And that is primarily a question of social relations, not of technical answers. Of course, technical answers are going to be important, but it is primarily a question of social relations and changing those social relations, putting the working class into power and transforming the social relations in the direction of socialism. Of course, that's going to be difficult because of the effects of ecological collapse, which are already baked in, but still, I'll finish with emphasis on social relations rather than technical objective processes.
Thank you, Alan. Okay, Hillel, you've got about 15 minutes to sum up. If you want to take those, you don't have to.
Thank you. Well, I'll try and I'll begin by replying to the insofar as they required a reply. The argument. Well, I agree with Matthew, so there isn't anything more to be said than what he said. I could add bits, but I'll leave it. I wasn't clear what the first speaker was talking about. He raised the question of energy, but in principle, if we had a rational or a socialist government, there wouldn't be a problem. Since quite obviously where we're going to is the use of hydrogen among other things, and that of course is limitless. I didn't understand his second point, which had to do with, what was it, planning or whatever. It's clear that capitalist firms, up to a point, have assimilated aspects of planning. That's quite clear. And if you look at the structure of firms today, it's very different from what existed 100 years ago. They increasingly forced by the nature of the economy to try and I wouldn't use the word planning, but because what they do is, in a sense, isn't planning, but let's say semi-planning or whatever. Modern society cannot run today without a central organization and without forecasting at least what is to come, etc. It's no accident that you have a conservative government actually providing a certain amount of money for ordinary people. It's a reflection of the changing nature of the structure. Now, what I think more than one person was doing was arguing against my attempts to try and show that in this transitional period there are forms which are changing. They're not forms which are socialist, but they're also not conducive to efficient capitalism either. And not to recognize it is just to stand on your head. It's clear that that is the case, that capital doesn't actually like them. And so they try to find ways around it whereby you have let's say a nationalized entity which is run by private enterprise. It still remains a nationalized entity, but it's run by private enterprise. So that's the kind of thing which has come into existence. Not to recognize that that the development of humanity isn't just a question of the particular mode of production. The mode of production can't stop the progress, the social progress which is going on. If it does, then it'll just die. So it can't stop that progress. It necessarily continues to exist. That doesn't lead you to any kind of reforms. It doesn't lead you to say that capitalism can be reformed. It can't. That just refers to a reality. That it's Marx who talks of the invading socialist society. So in that sense, I am a Marxist. And if you argue that Marx is wrong, go ahead, fine. That's what you would be doing. Not to recognize that there are a change in the forces of production and consequently a stress within the system is not to recognize reality. In other words, capitalism becomes not more efficient but less efficient over time. That is one of its contradictions. And of course it applies in particular in the transitional period. The fact which I mentioned, that capital has had to concede an elected parliament and an elected body, and then try to find ways around dealing with it, which is what it's done, is no accident. That is the nature of where we live. To simply regard this as the same as 200 years ago is to ignore reality. The capitalist class with this has also changed. It's become more conscious. It had to become more conscious in order to exist. During the period of the Second World War and immediately afterwards, a section of the capitalist class recognized itself what was going on and recognized that they could not last forever. A section did recognize that, and what they tried to do is to extend its life while recognizing it wouldn't last. That section of the capital class seems to have died off, or maybe it exists somewhere in the United States. I don't know. It appears as if there are numerous factions of the capitalist class in the United States, but it existed in Britain and was sidelined and moved off. Now you have a completely inefficient and stupid ruling class, it would appear, and we have to understand it in those terms. And Matthew's quite right to bring out some of the problems. We are in a crisis from which capitalism does not seem to have a way to get out. That is true. The consequences are considerable. Among other things, the capitalist class seems to have decided that that Parliament isn't where they need to sit, instead of which they have a series of people who seem to understand next to nothing. And it's highly inefficient, effectively, in its own terms. That, again, is a result of the transitional period, that's to say, the different forces which are operating. Clearly, the working class, however you want to put it, whether it's through strikes, whether it's working badly, or whatever other means, and the working class here includes the vast majority of the population. finds ways of protesting, maintaining itself, and among a minority in opposing the system itself. That's the way it is. So it's in constant movement, and it's hard to understand the totality of it. What we can't say is that it's the same as 200 years ago. It's not. It's very different, and it's much more developed. And the potential, of course, is enormous. What I'm not is pessimistic in the way the last person spoke. Of course, it is possible we'll end up with barbarism, but I think the chances are next to zero. I don't think there's any need for that kind of pessimism. The fact that in the period from 1945-46 down to 1992, we had a Cold War in which there was really no difference between the two sides. Let's say the Soviet Union was ruled by a small elite who never believed in socialism, who had nothing to do with socialism really, and the American ruling class, or at least the more intelligent section of it, knew full well what existed there, its contradictions, and the fact that it would probably end itself. I see that somebody other drew up a table of people who predicted its end, and they included me in it and said that I had predicted its end 13 times before it actually happened. Well, yes, it wasn't difficult to see it. After all, who on earth was I, a student in Russia, just talking to people? And it was clear. It was absolutely clear that it couldn't run. Obviously, if you were in the system, you couldn't say that, because they were afraid it would end earlier, or they didn't want it to end because they'd lose their jobs. But the point is that we have a system, or semi-system, within this transitional period, which is complex and interactive. If you don't understand the interactive parts of it, then you don't understand it. It isn't just a statement that we have capitalism. Yeah, you have capitalism, but it's not traditional capitalism. If you look at Marx, Marx's description is excellent. But if we look at what Marx said of the form of the enterprise, and he begins to describe the modern enterprise, but it's just the beginning, and it is clearly different from the present day. And not to see that is to stand somewhere on the moon and decide you're going to look at Jupiter or something. It's clear that we're in a transitional period with different forces at work, which we have to try and understand. And among them, what we see, of course, is a necessary development of the working class in the particular form it's now taking, and a development of the ruling class itself and of the means of production too, which have been changing. Now, people might say, well, the means of production have reached a point where they can destroy humanity, whether through the atomic bomb or through something else. That's perfectly true. The fact is they haven't done it. They haven't done it, and I never thought they would. And whenever people kept moaning on about it, I walked out of the room, because it was quite clear that nobody wanted to actually drop it because of the end results to themselves, which they knew. While it was possible it would happen, the chances were very low. And one has to look at it in these terms, see the interrelationships that are going on, and try and see what is likely to happen. At the present time, it is quite obviously more complex than it was. You've got the United States as a declining ruling class, to try a declining global ruling class, because the fact is the world depends on the United States. The United States is the ruling, not just the ruling power, but the ruling economic power. Trump, of course, was something else. It's not surprising that he's gone. So you have it, and unless you understand it in these terms and understand the particular role of the American ruling class, of course you're in trouble in trying to understand where the world is going. So its nature and the changes in the forms involved are crucial. What's now, which I think was mentioned, the question of China. What is the relationship between the United States and China? What is likely to happen with it? Now, clearly, it was the crucial area for the American ruling class, and we've seen what the nonsense Trump got up to. But one has to be able to argue this thing to understand what China itself is, and unless one understands that, unless one understands the very clear aspect that there are practically no socialists in China, one is living in a world of one's own. So the point I'm trying to get to is that we're living in a world of interaction. Matthew mentioned the fact that investment is low. That is undoubtedly the case. Since 2008, the ruling class is not investing very much. The rate of growth, consequently, is low. In China, the rate of growth is relatively high. What are the consequences of that? Quite considerable, obviously. And how is it going to work out? I don't know. The only reason I've brought it up is that one can't simply understand the present in terms of a possibility of barbarism, or without understanding the social interrelations existing in a transitional period and the complexity of the transitional period, which one doesn't have to be one wouldn't have to be a genius to talk about it in 1923 and understand and predict that something like what is happening could happen. That's to say, the interaction of the different layers of the ruling class and the different parts of it throughout the world. It's not difficult to see that would happen and that exists. And if one doesn't understand it, then you don't really understand very much of what is changing. Anyway, in general, as far as I can see, as far as I understand it, although we can all be pessimistic because we're not on the verge of a socialist society, that is true. On the other hand, capitalism is itself in trouble. And not to recognize that is to decide to be a pessimist for no good reason. It's not wonderful to live in a society which is in decline, but that is what is happening. Decline and the theory of decline is itself a subject which has to be explored further. Anyway, I just want to end on an optimistic note and say that I think the ruling class is in trouble today. It may be that the working class is also in trouble, that there is no ruling class body. But we can be optimistic that it will come about. It may not come about in the way it has in the past, but it will come about because it is necessary. And it is the only force which can actually drive the world further. Thank you.
Thank you very much, comrades. That was very enjoyable and very interesting discussion it led to, I believe. Certainly, socialism is not, it's inevitable, but it could take a long time until the working class has developed its forces to actually give it its final push. And of course, that's why we're doing all of this. This is why we're setting up organizations like the LLA, like Labor Against the Witch Hunt, etc., to organize our forces and to collectively decide and educate ourselves on these issues. Next week, we'll be discussing the role of the working class, what's so special about the working class, and how Marx and Engels envisaged why the working class would be the grave digger of capitalism, as they called it. Thank you very much for joining us, Hillel. Thank you very much for joining us in the audience, and we hope to see you next week. Good night.
Good night.